Less than a handful of megacorporations dominate every aspect of our lives. That may seem like an exaggeration, but from the breakfast that's on the table in the morning, to the mattress we sleep on at night, and everything we do, put on, or consume in between, all are largely dependent on these corporations. These are investment companies of immense proportions, and they manage the major money flows on Earth. They are the protagonists of the play which we are currently witnessing. So as not to take up too much of your time, I've summarized the most important information as briefly as possible. How does it work? Let's take as an example a company like PepsiCo, which is the parent company of many of the most popular soft drinks and snacks in the world. There appear to be many different competing brands, but they all come from the factories of a small number of corporations that together have a monopoly on the industry. Within the packaged food industry, there are a number of other major companies, such as Unilever, the Coca-Cola Company, Mondelez, and Nestlé. On this image, you see that virtually every well-known brand in the packaged food industry belongs to one of these corporations. You can easily get this kind of information. You can verify it on the websites of the relevant brands or on Wikipedia. Companies of this size are usually publicly traded and have a board where the largest shareholders call the shots. On websites like Yahoo Finance, we can find detailed company information, including who the largest shareholders of these companies are. Let's take PepsiCo again as an example. We see that 73.14% of the shares are held by no less than 3,379 institutional investors. These include investment companies, mutual funds, insurance companies, banks, and in some cases, governments. Let's look at who the largest institutional investors of PepsiCo are. As you can see, just 10 out of the 3,379 investors account for almost 1/3 of all shares. The combined share capital of these top 10 has a value of approximately $60 billion. But of those 10 investors, 3 own more shares than the remaining 7. Let's remember their names and let's see who owns the most shares at the Coca-Cola Company, Pepsi's big competitor. We see that just like with PepsiCo, the majority of the shares are held by institutional investors. Let's look at the top 10 and start with the last one of them. 4 out of these 6 institutional investors we also saw at the last 6 of PepsiCo. These are Norton Trust, JP Morgan Chase, Geode Capital Management, and Wellington Management. Now, let's look at the 4 largest shareholders. 3 of these we also saw in the top 4 at PepsiCo. They are BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. And there's another one, Berkshire Hathaway. These are the 4 largest investment companies on the planet. PepsiCo and Coca-Cola are anything but competitors. But also the other big companies that own many brands, such as Unilever, Mondelez, and Nestlé, are owned by the same small group of institutional investors. And you don't only find these names in the packaged food industry. For example, let's look up on Wikipedia what the largest companies are within the technology industry. Facebook owns WhatsApp and Instagram. Together with Twitter, they form the most popular social media platforms in the world. Alphabet is the parent company of all Google businesses, including YouTube and Gmail, but they are also the biggest sponsors and developers of Android, one of the 2 operating systems on which almost all smartphones and tablets in the world run. The other operating system is Apple's iOS. Finally, if we add Microsoft to the other 3, we see that 4 companies produce the software that almost all computers, tablets and smartphones in the world depend on. Let's see who owns the most shares of these powerful companies. If we look at Facebook, we see that more than 80% of the shares are owned by institutional investors. These are the same names we saw in the food industry. Again, the same investors at the top. Then Twitter, which with Facebook and Instagram makes up the top 3. Amazingly, we see that the company is also owned by the same investors. We see them at Apple, but also with their big competitor Microsoft. When we look at all the other companies that dominate the technology industry and build our computers, TVs, smartphones and household appliances, we see the same big investors who own a majority of the shares. We see this within all industries around the world. And just to show you that I'm not exaggerating, I'll give you another example. Let's say we want to plan a vacation. On our computer or smartphone, we look for a cheap flight to the sun through websites like Skyscanner and Expedia, both of which belong to the same group of institutional investors. We fly with one of the many airlines, of which the majority of the shares are often owned by the same investors or by governments, like Air France-KLM. The aircraft we fly is in most cases a Boeing or an Airbus. Again, we see the same names. We look for a hotel or an apartment through Booking.com or Airbnb.com. Once we arrive at our destination, we go out for dinner, then we write a review on TripAdvisor. The same investors are at the basis of every aspect of our journey, and their power goes even much further, because even the kerosene that fuels the plane comes from one of their many oil companies and refineries. Just like the steel that the plane is made of comes from one of their many mining companies. This small club of investment companies, banks and mutual funds are also the largest shareholders in the primary industries, where raw materials come from. If we look on Wikipedia for the largest mining companies in the world, we see that their shareholders are the same institutional investors we see everywhere else. The same goes for the largest agricultural companies in the world that our entire food industry depends on. For example, they own Bayer, the parent company of Monsanto, the world's largest seed producer, which produces 90% of all the cotton seed on Earth, as well as the majority of all other seeds. But these institutional investors are also the shareholders of the largest textile manufacturing companies in the world, and even the numerous popular clothing brands that turn the cotton into the clothes we wear are owned by the same group of investors. Whether we have the world's largest solar panel producers or the largest oil refineries, the shares are managed by the same companies. They own the tobacco companies, who produce all the popular tobacco brands in the world. But they also own all the major companies in the pharmaceutical industry and the scientific institutes that produce the drugs. They own the companies that produce our metals and raw materials, and the entire automobile, aircraft and arms industry where those metals and raw materials are processed. They own the companies that build our electronics. They own the big department stores and online marketplaces. And even the payment methods that we use to pay for their products. Because I want to keep my story as short as possible, I've decided to only show the tip of the iceberg. If you decide to investigate on your own, using the sources that you've just seen, then you will discover that even many of the most well-known insurance companies, banks, construction companies, telephone companies, restaurant chains, and cosmetic brands are owned by the same institutional investors we just saw. These institutional investors are, as I told you earlier, mainly investment companies, banks and insurance companies. They are in turn also owned by shareholders. Now, what is the most amazing thing? All of these institutional investors own each other's shares, and together they form an immense network that we can compare to a pyramid. The smaller institutional investors are owned by larger investors, who in turn belong to even larger investors. The visible top of this pyramid consists of only two companies, and we have seen their names many times by now. They are Vanguard and BlackRock. The power of these two companies is something we can barely imagine. Not only are they the largest institutional investors of every major company on Earth, they also own the other institutional investors of those companies, giving them a complete monopoly. According to a report by Bloomberg, one of the most respected institutions in the world in the field of financial data and analytics, experts expect that by 2028, both companies will collectively manage about $20 trillion in investments, and in the process will own almost everything on Earth. The same Bloomberg called BlackRock the fourth arm of government, because it is the only non-government entity that has a close relationship with the federal banks, also called the central banks. BlackRock not only lends money to the federal banks, but is also their principal advisor and the developer of the computer system that the federal banks use. Dozens of BlackRock employees had senior positions in the White House during the Bush and the Obama administrations, and currently under Joe Biden. BlackRock CEO Larry Fink is a welcome guest with many heads of state and politicians, and understandably so. He's the face of the company that pulls the strings. Yet Larry Fink does not pull the strings himself. In fact, BlackRock itself is owned by shareholders. And if we look at who those shareholders are, we come to a strange conclusion. We see that BlackRock's largest shareholder is Vanguard, and this is where it gets dark. Vanguard itself has a unique structure that makes it impossible to see who its shareholders or clients are. I think the next topic should start with a question. A random person like myself, with very little experience in video editing, using an old laptop, can in 20 minutes objectively portray that only two companies have a total monopoly over all the industries in the world. So the natural question is, why don't you hear about all of this in the media?
What? It's a good question.
Every day we have the choice between countless reports, documentaries, and television programs, and yet not one of them talks about this. Is it something not interesting enough? Or might there perhaps be other interests at play? The answer we get again from Wikipedia. About 90% of the international media is owned by 9 media conglomerates. The companies owned by these media conglomerates are too many to mention, so I'm just going to show you the most important brands that we all know. Viacom CBS is the parent company of, among others, all CBS channels, Paramount, where the most famous movies and series in the world come from, MTV, Comedy Central, Nickelodeon, the popular British Channel 5 and the popular Australian 10. Guess who the largest shareholders of Viacom CBS are? Before we look at the other major conglomerates, let's not forget to mention our extremely powerful streaming monopolists, Netflix and Amazon Prime, both of which belong to the same shareholders. Then AT&T, which is the parent company of Warner Brothers, HBO, Discovery Channel, CNN, Cartoon Network, TNT, DC, and many other well-known brands. Guess who the largest shareholders of AT&T are? The third one is the all-powerful News Corp. This company owns many of the most well-known national and regional newspapers, magazines and TV channels in the US, the UK and Australia. The shares of News Corp are owned by the American multi-billionaire Rupert Murdoch and by the institutional investors we see everywhere else. News Corp's sister company is Fox Corporation, which is also one of the most powerful media conglomerates on Earth. Just like News Corp, it is owned by the Murdoch family and the usual investors. Then the Walt Disney Company, a conglomerate of unimaginable dimensions, with many subsidiaries such as Pixar, Marvel, 20th Century, Lucasfilm, ABC, National Geographic, and Hulu. Who are their biggest shareholders? Another powerful media conglomerate is Comcast. This is the parent company of NBC, DreamWorks, Universal, the Sky Group, Focus Features, Xfinity, and many other major media brands. As you would expect, their largest shareholders are Vanguard and BlackRock. I could go on for hours and show that in almost every country on Earth, the local media is in the hands of these kind of conglomerates, which in turn are owned by our institutional investors or by extremely rich and powerful elite families. In the UK, for example, virtually all popular newspapers and magazines are owned by the Daily Mail Group, Reach and the aforementioned News Corp. In the Netherlands, the entire media is in the hands of the Persgroep, Mediahuis and Bertelsmann. And in Germany, the entire media is either controlled by the German government, ProSiebenSat.1, Axel Springer, and again, Bertelsmann, which is also a conglomerate of unprecedented dimensions. Not only is this the parent company of the largest book publisher in the world, Penguin Random House, and owner and founder of BMG Music, Bertelsmann also controls a large part of the European media through their subsidiary RTL, a company with 67 TV channels, 10 streaming platforms and 38 radio stations. Bertelsmann is owned by the ultra-rich Bertelsmann Mohn family, who openly collaborated with the Nazis. Because of this, Reinhard Mohn was held as a prisoner of war in the US. Besides RTL, Bertelsmann also owns a large part of the French mainstream media. And together with Mediaset, the powerful Italian conglomerate of former President Berlusconi that controls the most important part of the Italian mainstream media, they also own all popular Spanish TV channels. Now, to complete the picture, let's look at where the news comes from that all these media outlets are feeding us on a daily basis. The various news media do not produce their news themselves, but use information and images from news agencies such as Reuters, the Dutch ANP, and the French AFP. These organizations are anything but independent. Reuters is owned by the powerful Canadian Thomson family. The ANP is owned by Dutch investor Kees Omen, and the AFP is largely financed by the French government. The main journalists and editors who work at our media or at these news agencies are affiliated with important journalistic organizations, such as the European Journalism Centre. These are one of the largest funders of media-related projects across Europe. They train journalists, produce study materials, give internships at, for example, the ANP, and work closely with the world's largest corporations such as Google and Facebook. For journalistic analysis and opinion, all the major media outlets in the world use Project Syndicate, the most powerful organization within its field. It supplies the 506 most important media outlets in 156 countries. Project Syndicate, plus an organization such as the European Journalism Centre, together with the news agencies, are the connecting link between all the different media outlets around the world. When newscasters read the news from their teleprompters, there is a good chance that the text comes from one of these organizations. As a result, the global media is often synchronized in its reporting.
We are concerned about the trouble and trend of irresponsible, one-sided news stories
Plaguing our country.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
The sharing of biased and false
news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think. And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
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 In September 2020, the European Journalism Centre and Facebook set up a fund to support selected news organizations to do the reporting during the corona crisis. Let's see who the organizations are that, along with the news agencies, produce our news. At Project Syndicate, we see the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Open Society Foundation, and the European Journalism Centre. Then the European Journalism Centre itself. Again we see the Gates Foundation and the Open Society Foundation. And they also receive large donations from Facebook, Google, the Dutch Ministry of Education, Culture and Science, and from the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The organizations that are at the heart of our information flow are funded by the non-profit organizations of the same elite who also controls the entire media. However, a part of our tax money goes to these organizations as well. The last thing I want to show is an excerpt from a lecture that Belgian top virologist Mark van Ranst gave on January 22, 2019 at the Chatham House, a major non-profit organization in London, where important world leaders meet to discuss global issues. What Van Ranst is discussing is simply shocking. Van Ranst in fact explains how he has fooled the entire Belgian population during the swine flu through fear-mongering, out-of-context mortality rates, and media manipulation. He laughingly explains how he managed to impose the vaccine for the swine flu on the frightened Belgian population, a vaccine produced by the pharmaceutical companies he worked for.
Thank you very much, Ab. Thanks for the invitation. And I was asked to tell you about my experiences being the crisis manager, the flu commissioner for Belgium and highlighting the communication. And then you have one opportunity to do it right. I mean, day one is so important. In day one, you start your communication with the press, with the people, and you have to do it right. I mean, you have to go for one voice, one message. In Belgium, they chose to appoint a non-politician to do that. I mean, I have no party affiliations, and that makes things a little bit, at that time at least, a little bit easier, because you're not attacked politically, majority, minority. That doesn't come into play, and that was a huge advantage. The second advantage is that you can play in Brussels the complete naive guy and get a lot more done than you would otherwise be able to do. You have to be omnipresent that first day or the first days, so that you attract the media attention. You make an agreement with them that you will tell them all, and if they call, you will pick up the phone. When you do that, then you can profit from these early days to get complete carpet coverage of the field, and they're not going to search for alternative voices there. And if you do that, that makes things a lot easier. These first weeks, that's easy street when you have no opposition and everybody needs news and they can come to you for news, you can bring quite a lot of neutral information, and it is picked up, and it is well, the news is brought the way you bring it, and that is you can only do that in the first couple of weeks or months. And then you have to say, okay, well, we will have H1N1 deaths. Of course, that would be unavoidable. I used there Sir Donaldson's quote, where he said that in the UK, by the peak of the epidemic, 40 people would die per day at the end of the summer. So 62 at that time million people in the UK, 40 deaths a day. I worked it out for Belgium. That would be 7 deaths a day at the peak of the epidemic. I used that in the media. 7 Belgian flu deaths per day at the peak of the epidemic would be realistic. That is true in every year, even interpandemically. That is very, very conservative. However, talking about fatalities is important, because when you say that, people say, wow, what do you mean? People die because of influenza? And that was a necessary step to take. And then, of course, a couple of days later, you had the first H1N1 death in the country, and the scene was set and it was already talked about. And then you had to pick who is going to be vaccinated first. And then, well, women and children first, whatever. I mean, risk groups, they were important. And then I misused the fact that the top football soccer clubs in Belgium inappropriately and against all agreements vaccinated they made their soccer players priority people. So I said I can use that. Because if the population really believes that this vaccine is so desirable that even the soccer players would be dishonest to get their vaccine, I said, okay, I can play with that. So I made a big fuss about this. This is Van Ranst is raving mad. But it worked.